Welcome to the Financial Therapy Podcast. I'm your host and your financial therapist, Jane Monica Jones. In this episode, we're talking money, shame, deserving, and adversity. The latter, of course, we will all go through at some stage in our life. Through a loss of a job, maybe a loss of a loved one, an illness, or even having some mental health issues.
All walks of life, it didn't seem to matter what kind of income your husband might have or what kind of house that you lived in. You could end up, on the street.
How do governments, non-for-profits, and even us deal with adversity? And what are the impacts adversity have not only on our financial lives, but our sense of self-worth? We'll look at who deserves what when it comes to the public purse, and what are the hard decisions care organisations have to make with limited resources for those that face adversity. We'll also be delving into an unconscious bias that we know exists, but often don't want to talk about. It's called worthy bias, who we deem as being worthy of time, money, resources, and the like. To help unpack, uncover, and maybe enlighten us, we speak with Jan Hatch, a Gestalt therapist who has a master's in social and public policy. So thank you for joining us as we have a bigger conversation about us and money. And remember to subscribe to the Financial Therapy Podcast. Thank you so much, Jan Hatch, for being here.
It's a pleasure, Jane. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to dive right in because we've got so much to discuss. Do you want to just give us firstly a bit of your background?
Yeah, be happy to. I've worked in the sector for about 40 years, starting off as a volunteer in my teens, probably doing work around the church that my family belonged to. And then I went into working in the organizations as a professional, probably when I was in my late 20s, having worked in the banking sector and really being very appalled at, that whole capitalist making money and regardless of what else happened. So my first role was really, I was on a board of directors for a women's refuge, the first women's refuge in Canada back in the late 70s. And so that was all about providing emergency shelter for women who were leaving domestic violence situations or who sexual abuse, so that we had teenagers coming in who'd been sexually abused by step parents and others in their lives. And so that was a salutary sort of experience of really working in an on-the-ground service, where I met people and I worked with people and all sorts of women, all walks of life. It didn't seem to matter what kind of income your husband might have or what kind of house that you lived in. You could end up, on the street. And so that was a really eye-opening experience for me. And I then went on to set up the first national telephone helpline for carers when I moved to the UK. And so the carers organization that I worked with was pretty amazing because we were working with people who had to give up work to care for loved ones and who were relying for a large part of their financial security on government benefits because, they didn't have necessarily the money to live on and certainly often had to give up their work in their own lives and their own homes to provide care. And I then went on to work for 8 years with the Multiple Sclerosis Society, which was the fifth largest medical charity in the UK and the second largest MS organization in the world. And that was again a really fascinating experience because, of course, MS affects people in varying ways, from not very much to complete and total disability that people often live with for many, many years. And so the financial implications of multiple sclerosis are pretty significant in many, many cases. And because it affects people between the ages of 20 and 50 primarily, though younger people get it and older people get diagnosed with it as well, it's affecting people at the primary time of their life for starting their careers, starting families, and so the financial implications are really huge for them.
Before we started this conversation, you were talking a little bit about how, these organizations have a limited budget and they're having to make decisions about who gets that, who is worthy enough of sorts to get the limited budget or care that they have. I think it's a big conversation that we probably don't have enough of a conversation about. The thing called worthy bias or worthiness bias, or who is actually worthy to get our limited resource, what certain organizations have to play God with.
Well, and I think all organizations that offer support, whether they're from a governmental perspective, though, that's a big influencer in its own right in terms of, and government, of course, is embedded in our culture as a whole about who's worthy to receive support and who isn't. And that's a huge kind of area that we could delve into for hours, but we won't. But, you look at all kinds of services that are provided, this safety net we talk about to support people who run into difficulties in life, who lose jobs, who have mental health problems, who become disabled, who need care, who are homeless, who don't have family and friends to support them, and we know that the demographics of that is changing over time as women get older. And, so the largest group of people who are actually becoming homeless are women over 50 in this country, but they're kind of invisible to us because often they look like the people are supposed to look like who are actually well off. They look like middle-class people. They've had good jobs. They've had nice homes, and then they find themselves with no financial resources. So if we talk about organizations that have set up themselves to support these people outside of the government context, to add support services that are specifically for a particular group of people, like people aren't going to get from government. And these organizations are set up, as Dan Pilatus says, to solve the biggest problems in our world, the problems of hunger, of poverty, of homelessness, of disadvantage, of mental illness, of people suffering and living with chronic medical conditions that are disabling. And these organizations have to beg for money from people who then make judgments about whether or not the organization is worthy to receive their money. And so they jump through a million hoops to try and make their particular client group look worthy. And so there's a whole massive many hoops that people jump through to make sure that we can, it's a whole business in itself, marketing people who are poor, marketing people who are in need of our support, making them look worthy, making them look like they deserve our support. And you'll always find, I remember working with an agency once when I was at the MS Society, and they showed us a series of TV advertisements that they made. And they said, this is how it works. You start off showing people looking really, really sad and really, like those African children, with the flies and looking really skinny and everybody looking really downtrodden. You then ask for your support, and you end up the advertisement with them looking happy because your support has made them happy, healthy, deserving human beings again. So they start off being objects of poverty, but they end up being objects that make us feel good because we've supported them and we've made them healthy. And that's how it works in the nonprofit sector. And I could keep going for hours, Jane, so just tell me to shut up at any point.
Yeah, look, it is a big subject, Jan, and I think it's really interesting that there's that. What you're saying is around how we're almost building out sort of deserving storylines to make us give, but it's often that we don't consider it. I hadn't considered it enough. Building that image of viewed as being more deserving or more worthy. There's almost that battle between organizations
there is.
To try and build that image of our people being more deserving of your support, government support.
Yeah.
And how that becomes a marketing pitch.
Yeah, and it, because the competition is great, because the funds are limited, and because they're having to appeal to our individual motivations as donors, or there's a whole industry around how you get super rich people to donate to your organization, and then there's another body of work that's all about how you get corporations to support your organization, and you have to somehow make your group of people who need support attractive to them as a proposition for their marketing. So it's a very complex area. I think when you get down, so that's the big picture. When you get down to okay, so I'm in the organization now. I've got some money to support. I'll use multiple sclerosis as an example, to support people who need financial assistance to buy the appropriate wheelchair, or to make a home adaptation so that they can live in their home, or to help their carer, get a break on a regular basis. So I've got a certain amount of money available to me. So what I then have to do is I have to decide which category of people. So which hoops do they have to jump through in order to get my financial? So what I have to do is establish criteria that people then have to jump through those hoops in order to be able to get money from my organization to support them. So again, we're weeding out those people who are worthy of our support and those people who are just going to have to go find support somewhere else, or live their lives without support. And of course, I guess multiple sclerosis isn't a great example, because most of the people we know demographically who get multiple sclerosis are people in Western countries who are, generally speaking, in the prime of their life, between 20 and 50, who, generally speaking, look like we look, like you and I, Jane, white, middle class-ish, whatever that means, people. And so in a way, we can kind of imagine that we would want to support them, because there, but for the grace of God, go I. It could happen to me. I suppose the tricky bit comes when we're looking at homelessness, when we're looking at domestic violence, when we're looking at drug addiction and alcoholism, when we're looking at people with severe mental health issues who end up living on the street. And they probably don't look like we like to think we look. I mean, again, there, but for the grace of God, go I. But somehow or other, we make decisions based on what those people look like as to whether they deserve our support, because we have to give our support.
Yeah. That we have to be judicial in a way to decide who is worthy enough to get my support. Exactly. It's interesting, as you're talking about that, it's making me think, this program is financial therapy, so I'm always kind of looking at what's the motivation behind a lot of our issues around money or finances. As a psychotherapist, I'd be interested to understand, what is it kind of behind the motivation, why we see someone as being worthy for our support or whatever. What's happening inside that individual's mind, essentially, do you think?
Well, I couldn't know what's happening in an individual's mind, but what I can generalize from my experience of working with marketing companies in particular, and advertising companies who do massive amounts of market research to look at what will stimulate people to give. And I guess there are some generalizations. And I think one of them is that somehow or other we need to resonate with that individual. We somehow need to see ourselves in that other person, or if we don't see ourselves, maybe see a loved one. So, for instance, with the Cancer Council fundraising, most of the people who fundraise are people who have had cancer or who have had a loved one with cancer. And that universally affects lots of people, including homeless people and people with alcohol problems. But generally speaking, the people that are giving money to the Cancer Council, one could, I don't have these statistics in front of me, and I don't know this to be a fact, but I'm imagining, given what I know about human nature, most of them are people who look like me.
Right.
And again, that organization kind of decide those people are motivated to give because they've experienced it themselves. They know people, or that loved ones experienced it. And maybe that loved one had alcohol problems or mental health problems as well. But when I go there, most of the people I see are people who look like me.
Right. So are you saying that it's kind of conditional compassion, meaning that I can be compassionate within the sphere of what I know, or that these people look like me? When you say they look like me, they're my kind of people. I can experience myself in that, or I can experience my own family or someone I love that's going through that. So my compassion is more likely bestowed on this particular cohort than, say, something
Mm.
else. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. I mean, I'm not an expert in this field, and I don't have any research evidence to show that, but certainly that resonates with me.
Yeah.
That I'm going to give to something that matters to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I give to a lot of African charities that support people in Africa because I traveled for many years to and from Africa. So I have a personal relationship. There's a personal motivation for me around Africa because of the people that I met and the experiences that I had. But if I'd never been to Africa, I may not have any interest whatsoever.
Yeah, I understand. In that, it also makes me think, as a therapist, I'm often looking at early relationships, about our money stories, what it was like for us when we were growing up. And we call this sort of early attachment to our caregivers in order for us to survive. And something I often consider a bit is that the way we perceive survival has been kind of built in those early relationship years where, say, mom metaphorically is holding, we're sitting around a dinner table and she's got limited time and limited energy, and we're kind of being spooned out our portion around that dinner table. And I feel like we often just then take that for the rest of our lives.
Absolutely, yeah.
Was I, in order for me to get a bigger bowl full of mum's time and mum's love and mum's energy, then I need to be the good girl, or I need to be the right girl, or I need to be the whatever that definition is. And we then project that back into the world. We look at it in our political decisions. We look at it even our partners to a certain extent. Am I going to get that same sort of nourishment that I'm longing for, that was built way back in the early days? And we really project that competition / compassion, which one's here? Am I being compassionate, or I'm actually trying to be in competition to get the goodies? And I think that's where we're always sort of looking at that visor, or always determining that we're putting that out on our judgments on the world, and who's deserving, who's worthy, am I more worthy than them? Are they? Yeah. What do you think?
I think that's I think it's absolutely true. I think, we've got not just mum at the table, but we've got the culture that we grow up in, that mum's just an agent of the culture, and her mum was the agent of the culture. And, generations back, our cultural reference points and the standards by which we're supposed to behave. So if I talk about myself, I grew up in a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant household, and to be deserving, you had to sit at the table, be polite, you couldn't speak, you had to sit still, and then you got your dinner. And if you didn't do those things, you got punished and sent to your room without your dinner. So that the next time you came to the table, you'd behave because you'd want your dinner. Yeah. And so we grow up and that's a kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant kind of approach, that there are rules for behavior, that people are born inherently bad. And so what you have to do is you have to make them be good with this reward and punishment thing. Now, thankfully, we live in a different kind of world now. And for the most part, in many cultures, it's now we understand this business of attachment and how, we need to nurture and love our baby. They're completely incapable of doing anything for themselves. So it's all about survival. If we don't feed them because they cry too much, it doesn't help. And children are going to be exuberant, and they're learning to talk and walk and behave. And so, we have a different attitude now. And I'm hoping that kind of opening up of our knowledge about how those early years are so important, and how we need to kind of change our approach so that we're more open to the way children develop, how their nervous systems develop, how we can encourage that, how we can help them flourish and thrive by not making them go to their room if they talk out of turn at dinner without their dinner. I mean, that's just it's not going to get the result that we want. It's not going to get a healthy child, or it's going to create somebody who's going to have some issues around rigidity and the idea of perfection. And so I think this applies in this broader sense. Whatever we learned in our home about what made you worthy to receive love or acceptance or nourishment, we apply that when we grow up to the people around us. And so if they don't behave in the way that we were trained you needed to behave to be loved, then we're going to withdraw our love or withhold our love. And in a broader sense, that then applies to people outside of our immediate vicinity. If you're going to misbehave, have a drug addiction, then somehow or other you're not going to get love. You're not going to get the support that you need. And so you're right. It starts way back there at the beginning.
That's really interesting. I mean, that's again going back into what you're saying about, you're not going to get the support that we need. And that because organizations have a very limited resources, they have to make that decision of God, who gets our support and who is worthy and who's good. And, and I mean, when you've got a lot of comorbidity for certain client groups, they may be excluded, deemed unworthy for the care because they're not compliant in the requirements of what this organization is. And it's a challenge on the compassionate scope, spectrum, that because there are, certainly limited resources, that organizations are going to have to sometimes make hard-line calls on people that are not compliant with their services. And that means that certain people that are in need of care fall through the cracks because they're not compliant. I'm not saying there's a simple solution. I think it's important that we start looking at it, or at least having a conversation about this is what's happening. Yeah. Certainly in Australia at the moment, one of the biggest issues that we have is about the rate of the unemployment supplement and how low relatively it is for other OECD countries. And I think that there's often, it always makes me, when I'm thinking about politicians, when they're making those choices around the rate that should be out there, that it takes me back into that idea of being where that one kid around the family table says, no, the other one doesn't deserve it, and how, I mean, these people are adults making these political decisions. But to me, when I look at it, it looks like a whole bunch of kids saying, well, he doesn't deserve the more peace because he's been naughty. And,
and that's absolutely true.
Yeah. I mean, we make these judgments, and I think it's important that we kind of look at maybe the motivation behind our political systems and behind, who is more deserving, or who is that worthy bias, who is not worthy.
Yeah.
I think we need to have a little bit more of consideration to see, okay, well, where is my personal bias on this? Am I projecting that onto these decisions?
Yeah. And that is a really good description of of where it all stems. So it comes from our personal background, what we learn about the world and what's okay within our family, what's acceptable and makes us worthy within our family. But as I said before, that family is in a culture which also has its own compliance requirements and its own decision making around what's worthy and what isn't worthy. And that goes through our political system and through our charitable system and through our churches. And yes, humans are really good at defining what's worthy and what's in and what's out. I mean, it's kind of that tribal idea. You're either in our tribe or you're out. And in order to be in, you have to look a certain way, behave a certain way, have a certain amount of stuff, or treat people in a certain way, speak a certain language. And if you don't, then you're out.
Yeah.
And certainly in the world that we live in now, our system here in this country and other countries as well, it's very punitive.
Mm.
The deserving poor are those who are willing to work, regardless of what kind of working conditions they have or how much money they make. Doesn't matter. They just need to be willing to work, toe the line, do what they're told, Don't make a fuss, a bit like the dinner table at my house. Don't make a fuss. Don't say you don't want to eat your peas or you're not going to get anything. Don't kick your brother under the table because that's misbehaving. Don't somehow step out of that norm that's been set, that you've had no contribution to setting at all. Because if you do, you're not going to get. You're not going to get what you need. And unfortunately, that's the kind of work. It's not like that everywhere, as we know. And certainly there's a whole new resurgence of a push for a basic income, that every human being just deserves an amount of money that will enable them to be housed and to eat and to house and feed their families. And the research around that is really phenomenal, in that when in the places where they've done that, it hasn't meant people have stopped working. In fact, people have been able to work more because they don't have to actually stay home and take care of their children because there's nobody there, because they're all at risk. It motivates people because it gives them the sense that they're deserving,
Yeah. And it's a baseline deserving. It's in, I have a right to be able to thrive in a way, regardless of my background, my trauma, my race, my creed. It just has that sort of basic right to thrive, I think, which is what you're talking about. It was interesting that you were talking about being in the tribe, and we know that shame, in a way, is an evolutionary way of treating people in the tribe in order that they conform to social norms. I like to talk about money and shame often because it's something that we don't talk enough about, how much we do feel a lot of shame. I certainly, when I'm working with clients, it's one of the big pieces that I had myself projected here of what I was going to achieve, and life turned up in a very different way. But as we have, and you've said many times, as we have these certain conformed ideas of the way we should be operating, whether it's around work or achievement or success or good enough to get the goodies, then we kind of shame people if they're not that. And I think the benefit of what we're seeing in COVID, and with a lot of people losing their jobs, is that life can throw you curveballs, and it's got nothing to do with whether you're good enough or you're got the right stuff, or you're, right in line with what the expectations of society. And I think we need to kind of soften this idea that anyone at any moment, if through illness, being underinsured, it could all possibly, through divorce is a big piece, it could all fall over. And why should we be punished by not having systems in place in a civilized society that can support us? And so I think that, again, it's that worthy bias. It's like we've got this internal perception of what we deem as being who is worthy and who is not worthy. And I think it's a conversation we need to open up a little bit more to see, actually, this is an unconscious bias in me. This is because of my history, because of my dinner table scenarios when I was a kid. And this is, if we bring enough awareness to it, then maybe public policy such as universal basic income can be, maybe put on the table a bit more, or at least, we can raise the rate of, support funding for people in Australia or anywhere around the world, or wherever people are listening, that actually that's a kind of a human right, is that we can be taken care of if the economy is capable to be doing so.
Yeah. And we know that it is, because, it's just a matter of priorities. But I want to pick up on what you said about shame, because I think this is really important. We've been talking about how organizational structures, government structures kind of apply this to us and sort of shame us. They've kind of got a shame-making element to them, that you're not working hard enough to get a job, so we won't give you quite enough to live on, and we'll make you jump through a million hoops and try to find jobs that are non-existent and aren't there, but you still have to do it. But But we apply this shame to ourselves as well. So it's not just from the culture and from the society that we live in. We have embedded in ourselves this shame. So the number of times that I spoke to people with MS who had been unable to carry on working because of the impact of the disease and the symptoms on them and the disabilities they acquired, who were ashamed of themselves for not somehow beating it or eating the right diet or doing the right amount of exercise, and were ashamed to need support because they've become chronically ill or disabled. And this is something I'm sure that you encounter a lot in your work, that this shame for not meeting the criteria, for not being worthy enough, that gets embedded in us. We carry it into our own lives as well. So we shame ourselves, for not working. I can remember when I worked at the MS Society, because my staff were all working with people one-to-one with multiple sclerosis. And it was, really dedicated, really committed, really trying to help people get through those hoops that they had to get through, even if it didn't look like they could to start with. We worked ourselves to the bone, really, to try and get everybody that we could helped. And that was what we felt our mission in life was. While other people in our organization were doing the financial accounting and doing the marketing and having fun with the advertising people and, managing replacement of light globes and, that kind of thing, not working at the coalface with individuals. And so I made a rule that my staff needed to leave work at 5:00 in the afternoon because they needed to go home and take care of themselves and have a break. And I can remember my boss took me aside one day and said, "I noticed that all your staff leave at 5:00 and everybody else is still here till 6:30 or 7. The finance team, most of them are still here at 6:00, the marketing team." I said, "They leave so they can take care of themselves, so they can actually manage this on behalf of the organization, this massive amount of emotional upheaval that is being presented to them from individuals every day." And I said, "And I'm not going to have you shame my staff for leaving and taking care of themselves so that they can come back in the morning and continue to support the people that we're here to support. You guys are doing necessary jobs, but you're not being bombarded with this emotional trauma. You get traumatized yourself if you don't take care of yourself in those kind of organizations." And that's largely because the people who encounter these difficulties in life are themselves full of shame and a sense of unworthiness because they're not conforming to what's worthy. So I think, it's a huge issue that kind of permeates at every level. And we live in a society that continues to shame people for not fitting the norm.
Yeah.
And that then becomes an added burden. Not only do you not have a home or a job or the ability to walk, but now you have to feel ashamed about it.
Yeah. Yeah. You've really touched on something that I often speak to my clients who have been working at home, of course, in the time of COVID. And the big issue for them, working mothers that are juggling to get their kids on time, get them to school and on time in pre-COVID, all the requirements of needing to look after a family as well as holding down a full-time job. And when their personal lives are impinging on their work life, how much they overcompensate in order to continue to be professional and continue to be able to give their absolute 110% at the risk of maybe being present for their children. And what's been interesting speaking to a lot of my clients this time is like how much of a relief it has been to get off that treadmill, to say actually to be able to spend time with the kids in a really nourishing way and very present way has been a relief, and still being able to do the work, still being able to do what is required for their job as well. And I think that's a big piece that we again get shamed about is that are we not giving enough blood, sweat, tears, bones for the organization and work that we have in order to get the pay packet, in order to look after ourselves and our children and things like that. So I think that cultural or societal expectation that you have to give every part of yourself 100% to the pay packet over life in general. And I think that COVID has really opened up that possibility, like, what's this all for? Survival is our need to survive is pushing us where we have to compromise so much of ourselves. And I'm not saying that work is not important, but it's just to see that we maybe is our boss or is our organization pushing something that's kind of a little unreasonable in ourselves, because they're being pushed.
It's the shareholders. It's all about global making of money, but it's not making of money for us or for our benefit. It's not that much different from the days of the Dark Ages, in the 11th century, when serfs just worked and worked and worked and worked and worked, and not for their own benefit. They just worked to enrich the lord or the king or the person who had all the power. It's not that much different now, except that instead of necessarily individuals, we now have corporations
and shareholders, faceless shareholders.
Require us to work and work and work. And this is where so many people fall through the cracks. We're still living in a world where people become disabled, people become ill. How many people have cancer in our society? It's something like 25% of people will have cancer at some point in their life. Something like 49% of young women will be sexually abused before the age of 25, which will result in some form at some level of trauma. All the men who have to go to war or who have to work 80-hour weeks or, are expected to support everybody in their family because they're the only ones that are actually going to be able to get a job that's going to pay enough or that's going to provide enough resources. So we are actually living in a culture where most people are living with the shame of not being able to achieve what we think worthy people achieve, which is fancy cars, big houses, economic freedom of some kind that comes from, and it's rare. It's a rarity. It's what percentage of the population has got to that point where they can have a BMW in the driveway and a house and a beach house and a fancy holiday overseas every year? Very small percentage. So most people are actually living in the middle of that bell curve, where they may have gotten a few steps ahead, but 5 minutes later, they're a few steps behind because COVID comes and they lose their job.
Yeah. Or they get ill.
Or they get ill, or they get cancer and they have to have time off work, or they get some other chronic illness, or, they have trouble with alcohol because the pressure's too great, and so it goes.
Yeah. And so it just shows that very fragile house of cards at any moment. And yet we're being internally and externally, as you were saying earlier, we do it to ourselves. We are flogging ourselves and society is flogging us for a certain expectation. And we can't get off that expectation treadmill, really. We're kind of, a slave to it. Yeah. And we're all kind of in this soup of expectation and ideals.
Yep. Like you, Jane, I see a lot of people, even though I'm not a financial therapist, I'm a Gestalt psychotherapist, I see a lot of people who are carrying a lot of shame. And a lot of what people talk about is this concept of worthiness.
Mm-hmm. So, Jan, it has been absolutely gorgeous and wonderful and insightful speaking to you. I think we've gained a lot about, looking at the pressure that we put ourselves under. And I just, as we finish up, is there anything that you, I suppose, wanted to share with our listeners about how we can deal with what, the internal and external expectations we certainly have financially? As we've been talking about this big subject of worthiness, or what we deem as being worthy or worthy bias.
Well, I guess what I'd like to say, it comes back to that concept, I think, of compassion, which is certainly in the air everywhere around us now. But I find that for myself over the years of working in this field, that really what helps people kind of feel the presence of compassion really brings this all to some kind of resolution for people. And it's not just compassion of others, though that's what we do in psychotherapy, is we provide a space where people can be in the presence of a compassionate person who's not demanding anything of them, but who's just there to support them in particular ways. But it's also about self-compassion. And when we can have compassion for self, we can then start to have compassion for the others around us. It really starts at home with self-compassion. It's not something that you can apply to everybody else in the world and not yourself. You have to really apply it to yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. In my own work, really, it starts with that compassionate self and how we deal with the big issues in our life, not just financial, but relational as well. So what would you say to listeners about, how they could best cope with or deal with, some of the pressures that we have in life?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we go back to the whole issue of shame that we've discussed, I think it's having the courage to seek out the kind of support that you need from a therapist or a counselor, and be willing to kind of unpack a little bit in that safe environment, that safe and supportive environment. What is it? Where does that shame sit within you? And how does that look when you take it out and show it to another person? Knowing that you're not going to be judged for it and having the courage to do that. Because it is until you start shifting that shame and kind of navigating it that you can really sort of shake it up into a different place.
Thank you so much, Jan, for challenging some of the concepts we might have about deserving and worthiness, and particularly shame, and how important it is for us to get courageous, with some help, of course, and hopefully we can invite a little more self-compassion, particularly around our own financial situation. You can find out more about Jan Hatch in the show notes and head over to financialtherapy.org for more resources on how you can be better with money. If you're loving the show, please subscribe, rate and review, and stay tuned for more bigger conversations about us and money.